International Women Summit 2020. NICE International Women Summit 2020 is organized to bring together the dynamic women experts in the field of international relations from around the world. It is the first women summit organized by NICE in a very short time, at the time when there is flood of men. Our aim is to reflect the fact that there are enough excellent women experts in the field of international relations, foreign policies, and security issues. We have around 71 experts from 12 countries, including Nepal, India, Bangladesh, Sri Lanka, Pakistan, the US, the UK, Russia, Armenia, the Philippines, Switzerland, Indonesia. There are 10 sessions, which is taken place at two Zoom rooms simultaneously. This is the 8th sessions of the summit. It will be moderated by Dr. Abhiruchi Oza. And Dr. Abhiruchi Oza is an assistant professor, Department of Politics and Governance at Central University of Kashmir. She holds PhD from Jawaharlal Nehru University. She has combined research, technical teaching and activism in her work. Her recent publications include 2 decades of development, gender and citizenship in democratic South Africa, issues of under representations, mapping women in Indian politics, women's political representation in the 16 Lok Sabha, continuity contesting or change, among others. Thank you, Dr. Abhiruchi Oza, ma'am. The floor is yours.
Thank you so much. I take this opportunity to welcome everybody. You have been here, I hope, like I have been here in the sessions. We had some really, really nice presentations. So we now come to session 8. If you look at the panel, gender is a common thread that's bringing everybody, all the presenters together. And I'm really thrilled to be part of this session and moderating. Let me sort of tell you the rules as I have been told by the organizing committee. Everybody has 10 minutes. You would hear kind of a slight bell from the side of organization when 10 minutes is over. All the questions and comments must come in the chat box. We are not going to take any voice questions. And I would sort of keep my comments for the end. I have been given less time. So let's straight away go to the presenters. Let me introduce our first presenter for today, Dr. Aditi Paul. She's a research associate at NICE, and her presentation topic is women in foreign policy. And I hope through her presentation, she makes it more sort of narrows it down for us. Dr. Aditi, over to you. Your 10 minutes starts now. Dr. Aditi, you have to unmute your mic. Your mic is muted. Your mic.
Now am I audible now?
Yeah, perfect.
Oh, great. So thank you so much for that introduction. So we are gathered over here to discuss gender and international relations. And I think that gender definitely expands any topic related to IR. And I will be taking the next few minutes to discuss female leadership in high politics. I think that for long, feminists have advocated female leaders because they love a peaceful atmosphere. They are naturally very caring and virtuous. And I think much of this understanding comes from the fact that they can give birth, and so that makes them creators rather than destroyers. But there are type 2 kind of women as well who are more aggressive and assertive in their behavior. I mean, to cite a few examples, you have Condoleezza Rice. She held office in one of the most significant periods in the history of United States of America. She was National Security Advisor. She was also the state secretary. So then there's Jean Kirkpatrick, who was also the US ambassador to the United Nations in 1981, a woman who we do not consider as soft. Indira Gandhi, Indian Prime Minister. Then you have Margaret Thatcher, another uncompromising British Prime Minister. Chandrika Kumaratunga, President of Sri Lanka, showed her assertiveness when dealing with the LTTE. And Sheikh Hasina, one of the longest serving Bangladesh Prime Minister. and is applauded for Bangladesh's economic success. So these examples, as well as many others, are of women who are far from the angel-like characteristics with which we normally would associate women with, and are rather very bold and outspoken speakers. And I think that this is also rightly true, that it should be the case, because when you are in an official position, your voice needs to change. You need to come out from your reluctant female mode and begin to speak on behalf of that position. But when we talk about what is the percentage and the proportion of women in high politics, in foreign policy, then that is very less. If I bring out some statistics, some data, it would be more clear that out of the 193 countries of the world, only 19 countries have never allowed a female to become a head of state. Countries such as Afghanistan, Yemen, Saudi Arabia, Egypt, then Algeria, and many more have never had a female head of state. India has had 2 female prime ministers, but that was occupied by one person, which was Indira Gandhi. China has had never a female premier. USA has never had a female president. So clearly women are underrepresented in the high politics. And I think that this issue doesn't need to be stated anymore, or it doesn't need any embellishment. And rather I feel the funding should now be going to areas and into researching why women are not made to feel part of the team. I mean, who is benefiting from putting women behind the glass ceiling? What are the assumptions carried by people who are dominating the field that is allowing to overlook the participation of other genders? I also feel that there's need to research stereotypes of what a powerful officer should look like. Is it the age? Is it the gender? Is it the viewpoint that they must carry? Because what happens in the end, those carrying assumptions then begin to appoint such people who are fitting into the stereotypical image, and even if it means compromising the competency level required for that post. My discussion will not be complete if I don't mention some of the reasons that I feel is because of which women lack in foreign policy positions. I will be enumerating 3 of them. I'm sure there are many, but I'll stick to 3 as it also is encompassing many other points. So number 1 is lack of support. Now, I don't think it is absolutely offending to say that one needs support for rising. One needs allies who support your decision. You need followers to carry out your program, to execute it. And I think that this point is even valid for men, because they do make relationships for calculated reasons. And by support, basically, I mean, you know, a tiny remark like, oh, Samantha, great point made. This remark made in a boardroom full of men is a supportive gesture, and women do not get the credit for their ideas or their program idea. And so without support of allies, you're not going to go ahead. You cannot advocate issues at national, regional, international level. By support, I also mean building a coalition of women organizations, women NGOs, or negotiators, mediators, so that you can make this network of allies and you amplify women voices. By support, I also mean gender parity that should be followed at the ministry level. As of now, no country has reached a gender parity in the share of women in their country's legislature till date. But I find that Nordic countries are doing far better, and they come closest to the political gender parity, with women accounting for 43% of parliamentary members. The highest share is shared by Sweden, which is having 47% of women in their legislative seats. Therefore, I feel that many ways Nordic countries are forward thinkers, and they're not afraid to see women on top. In 2014, Sweden announced a radical foreign policy called feminist foreign policy. Iceland, another Nordic country, is the first country in the world to ever appoint a female president in 1980. Iceland is also famous for electing the world's first female gay prime minister. By appointing Sanna Marin as the Prime Minister of Finland, another Nordic country, Finland is now the country which has elected the world's youngest Prime Minister. So these examples are definitely very encouraging, but they are very few. I mean, simultaneously in the world we have where women are not allowed to own their land, they're not allowed to open a bank account, they are discriminated in the labor market, they cannot take up jobs, and so on and so forth. The second factor I feel which is inhibiting female to rise up to level of senior executive political roles is interest in politics. I mean, women must be interested to engage themselves in the political system by holding different types of office, attain positions at government institutions, in military and civilian missions. Women must fight for positions as lawmakers, policymakers, corporate managers, top officials of unions, political parties, special interest groups, etc. Because these are the steps of a ladder to reach, let's say, to the level of a prime minister or a president or a state secretary and that sort. By interest, I also mean interest to emulate the examples set by the successful countries. And I guess that for this, both men and women must be interested to examine the prototype that has been created by Sweden, which is the feminist foreign policy, and see how much can be done in their country's circumstances. And the quick final point I'll make, the third reason is literacy. And by literacy, I don't mean literacy in general, because education gender gap is anyways high. I would recommend everyone to read the yearly reports published by World Economic Forum called the Global Gender Report, which talks about these discrepancies. But I'm talking here about literacy as in to research how many female students are enrolling themselves into subjects like political science, IR, history, etc. How many are taking it to higher levels like MPhil, PhD, masters. How many are sitting for competitive exams like civil services. Because these aspects show how many women are interested or ignorant about politics and are willing or not willing to be critical thinkers. Getting educated also means building your own personal excellence. And I think when you are in a higher position, you should not be Googling the terms of politics and constitution and things like that. You should rather be backing your arguments with a lot of data and information and show it that yes, you are credible enough to be seated where you are. And so with this, I'd like to finish, and not without a remark, that diversification in international politics will take time. Work is still required to consider women as an asset. And I guess only then we can see women less as a diplomat's wife and more as a diplomat herself. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Paul. A very interesting take on women in politics. I was also wondering, would you sort of broaden it by not looking at only the country heads, but also looking at women who are in foreign policy, because that's the topic, at various different levels, and then sort of broaden it up. And also the fact that when you're looking at why they are not there, the question of what happens when they are there, because the gendered construction also sort of plays out for women in a particular manner when they are they are finally there in international relation as diplomats, as heads of the country, and various other capacities in which they operate. So thank you so much for your presentation, and we would sort of come back to your presentation in the end. I'll reserve my comments. I'll quickly invite the other presenter. The next presenter is Ms. Neha Bansal. She is Asia Fellow, Harvard University, ASH Center for Democratic Governance and Innovation. And title of her presentation today is Feminism and Authoritarian Regimes. Over to you, Ms. Bansal, and you have 10 minutes that starts now.
Thanks, Abhiruchi, and thanks, Aditi, for some very, very valuable points. I was wondering if we could have, in the spirit of what Aditi mentioned, more videos on so that we could see each other, because this is, after all, an interaction between some very, very key women in the region. So if we could start with having some more videos and we can see you. Well, I firstly wanted to agree with a couple of things that Aditi said, but also a couple of departures. The main point I want to make in departure to what Aditi says is that, yes, we need more women leaders, we need more women participation, but what is the on what terms are we going to participate and lead? And I think it is about time that we lead on our own terms, and that is really to use the female mode and make that our strength rather than actually shying away from it. The reason why I say this is because, the World Economic Forum, again, a report that Aditi alluded to, talks about the fact that gender parity is something that we're not going to achieve for the next 100 years. So neither I'm going to see gender parity in my lifetime, and neither is my daughter, perhaps maybe towards the end of her lifetime. So we need to ask very, very different questions at the moment. And we need to look at different areas as well. One of the areas that we have been looking at is democratic regimes, because we believe that democracy is a regime that, respects human rights, sort of supports women rights and things like that. But democracy in and of itself doesn't do that. It is the participation of different groups, it's the participation of civil society, etc., that allows for the participation of women and the realization of rights. But let's also look at this participation, because what it does is that when you have participation of different groups, you also have participation of groups like conservative religious groups or business lobbies that don't necessarily push for women's rights. And I think two examples that come to my mind immediately are the US, in fact, one of the most developed countries that still doesn't have a federal law for maternity care at the federal level. And then we have the next largest democracy in the world, which is India, which has actually slid back on the gender parity report. So there's definitely something there. And so therefore, I think we need to put the question rather than just having answers. Now, when you look at authoritarian regimes, um, of course, there's a tendency to look at them as repressive regimes, and therefore they follow repression in certain areas. But by logic of that, they can't follow repression in all areas. So they might be following repression in, say, economic areas, political areas, but one of the areas that has been less studied is actually their support for gender-friendly policies. And they do that for various reasons. One is, of course, to get the buy-in of women, and the other is also to ensure that they are seen to be compliant with various international regimes or conventions like the ILO Convention and the UN Convention. And some of the examples that come to my mind, for example, is Morocco, where you have a very, very low, democratic sort of, not very, very low, but low democratic institutions, rule of law, and you have a very powerful act that was enacted there. That's the Women's Personal Act that was enacted by King Mohammed under an authoritarian regime. Now, having laid this context, I want to come back to Asia. Of course, in the world, we have about more people living under authoritarian regimes now than democratic regimes. So you have 53% of people, according to one study, that lives under authoritarian regimes. That makes it even more important to look at this. But coming back to Asia, so you have an increase in authoritarian regimes right from 1945 until the Cold War. And then you have a syndrome called the hybrid regimes, which is, authoritarian regimes that are in transition from moving from democracies to authoritarian regimes. But they really didn't move. They stayed static, and their status quo was in their hybridness. And one way in which they maintained their hybrid nature was by being authoritarian, but also by adopting various decorative democratic institutions. Again, here one key one being women's rights. Now, so you have across Asia a movement from electoral democracies, Indonesia, Philippines. Then you have competitive authoritarian regimes, Malaysia and Singapore. You have hegemonic authoritarian regimes, Cambodia, Vietnam, and absolutely closed authoritarian regimes, China. And I'm going to come back to the example of Vietnam in a little while. But these regimes have sort of seen, a complete takeover of power, whether it is by sort of having an opposition, but having their own loyalists in the opposition, or by having fake oppositions, or even in terms of having elections, but really not using that to its full power. So, as Dr. Morgan Reza says, Center for Governance and Public Policy, he says that Asia has moved not just from hybrid authoritarian regimes, but something called sophisticated authoritarian regimes. And the post-COVID time is going to see an even higher rise in that. We've already seen in the last couple of months, years' time, countries like Cambodia, Thailand, Philippines sort of coming in and using military power, coming back of coups, jailing opponents. I can even say that about India. And you also have several military rulers who military units that came in during the COVID time, a belief that authoritarianism is a better form of government to sort of crack down on issues like COVID. So all in all, we already have 53% of our population, according to one study, that's under authoritarian governments, with a trend of increase in authoritarian regimes. Now, the most interesting example, as I promised I would come back to, is Vietnam. And Vietnam has seen one of the most drastic shifts from, competitive authoritarian regimes and so on. Now, in the 20th century and currently as well, the Communist Party of Vietnam has invested very heavily in gender-friendly policies, to the extent that the highest labor force participation, the women highest labor force participation is from Vietnam currently in the world. You also have a large number of women in Vietnam in senior positions. You have the current acting president of Vietnam, Dang Chinh Nong, if I pronounce that correctly, who's a woman, and a woman billionaire. But what's happening in spite of this, in spite of having an authoritarian regime and I think I've established the point that they do support women friendly policies, but what's actually happening to women in their homes? Well, the case in Vietnam, despite everything, is not very good in the sense you have sexual violence, you have a Confucian sort of culture which looks at civility among women in the home, meaning her to be loyal, to do certain activities. The sex ratio in Vietnam is not looking balanced at the moment. So there is a sort of contrast in what's happening, despite the fact that authoritarian regimes are supporting women-friendly policies. And here I want to step in and go back to what Dr. Smita had said, that we've got to move away from the woman mode, if I understood that clearly. The reason being that while all of this happens in Vietnam, you have a discourse that started again in the 70s, which didn't go through very well, which is the Asian style feminism, the exotic other woman. And according to this, the pushback is that, gender parity reports, the international system looks at women in a certain way, women empowerment in a certain way, just as we look at women exploitation in a certain way. So we look at education, we look at, economic participation, health, political participation. But that's not where we need to operate. We need to operate in what women bring to the table. And that's what this discourse talks about, which is that how can Asian women play a role in being spiritual symbols, whether it is in foreign policy, cultural symbols, upholders of traditions, festivals, and things like that. And how can we take our place using things like this? Because between the dichotomy of democracy, authoritarian regimes, between the dichotomy of exploitation, or not being empowered, and a certain regimented international system of empowerment, which is basically these 4 5 areas, there is a push for what is the Asian woman really want, and I think that's where our opportunity lies. Again, I want to come back to another example to push for, this point even further, which is India. So in India, we have Modi's government, which tried to look during the 2014 campaign. They tried to get the women's share of participation, as well as voters. And at that point, they started the women's safety campaign. Didn't go down very well. I'll just take 2 minutes. And they couldn't sort of capture the woman voter. They've been investing in schemes like Jan Dhan Yojana, Beti Bachao, Beti Padhao, etc. thereafter. And in the 2000 elections, that according to one report, they had even more women voters. But like I said at the beginning, gender parity has actually slid back in India. And then I come to my last point, which is that the reason why we need to look at what is the Asian style feminism between authoritarian regimes, because that's where we are headed, 53% and more, is between the US and China push and pull. It's not going to be a dichotomous one between democracy and authoritarian regimes. We've got to find more ways in which the two sides, the West and the East, in a way can engage. And one of them is women in authoritarian regimes. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Ms. Bansal. You have flagged a lot of points, and sort of, if we also connect to the earlier presentation, she was talking about representation, but one aspect that sort of did not get touched upon is that of Africa. And if we look at the commonalities that the Asian experiences also have, one also thinks that if you look at the representation, the ones who get represented in different kind of authoritarian regimes would also be women who would be critically challenging, differentiating themselves with not only the so-called construction of feminists within the liberal framework, but also the differentiation is within Asian fold or within the African fold from anybody who's talking about or who's using feminism. So in terms of reality, if you look at the agendas, there is a problem that is sort of being constructed, and you would have several levels of dichotomies that gets unfolded in these areas. So thank you so much for engaging presentation. I'm sure you're going to have a lot of questions, and we can have that towards the end. Let me now call upon the next presenter, Dr. Shabana Fayaz. She is head of the department, Defense and Strategic Studies Department, Quaid-e-Azam University. She's going to present on gendered perspective on Pakistan's anti-COVID-19 policy. Over to you, Dr. Fayaz. You have 10 minutes, which starts now.
Hello, everybody. It's a great experience to be listening to such a galaxy of women from all across South Asia. And I'm very, very pleased. I don't know whom to connect in future and whom not to. I really desperately need the emails and contacts of everybody. So I'm really inspired by the energy that's being generated over here. Coming to the gendered response from Pakistan's perspective, specifically, it is a policy analysis. But you cannot do the policy analysis without looking into the contextual parameters of the policy, like the gendered policy or gendered component in the Pakistan's anti-COVID whole debate and policy. I was just before coming here, I was a bit late reading another mail through it. Was one of the fellow from India who has written on how the women in India are suffering or have suffered. So I could immediately relate to that there's so much resonance that exists on the issues. And similarly, listening to Dr. Neha as well, so much resonance that one can relate to the issues, challenges, and the COVID-19. So basically, contextual parameters in case of Pakistan, if you look, is Pakistan stands at the low gendered indexes worldwide. I won't go into the figures. This is a good safe point to start with. We are very slow with the social, economic, legal, and educational stats on the begin with. I feel, and having a career in academia, and also some have my educated women and the women at the grassroots level in the country. And this continues to happen for decades and decades in our country. And I think this is something that is explainable why the women remain a much neglected subject in the policy implementation. You have the pronouncement at the highest level, but implementation is a gap area. Similarly, the women have been, in case of Pakistan, and we must celebrate that the women are the quiet warriors, on the frontline warriors in our case, specifically the healthcare department. You know, the nursing facilities that they have been giving, paramedics they have been doing, and even engaging with the law enforcement agencies and so on and so forth. But somehow they are not flagged much. And similarly, the doctors who had to leave their small children and be on more than 52 hours duty long in that. So announced in Pakistan case and the policy, there were some elements in the religious lobby who tried to see that corona as one of the doings of the because of un-Islamic practices. A religious scholar who gave a sweeping statement saying that since some of the women in Pakistan are behaya, they call the one who doesn't follow the Islamic norms, so that is why the COVID has happened. So 5 hours, there was a massive protest against that statement, and he and Prime Minister had to call and said, "You have to take back these words." But I say taking back doesn't matter.
I think there's some problem with Dr. Fayaz's internet that also tells you about the problem of internet connectivity. I don't see her here. No, Dr. Fayaz is not here. So let's do one thing. While she's trying to come back to internet, shall we move to the next presenter? And then we will come back to Dr. Fayaz towards the end. Okay, so can we have Ms. Gayatri Rajpurohit? She's a research scholar, Central University of Gujarat. She's going to present on explaining double burden in the midst of crisis, women and the pandemic.
Hello, ma'am.
Hi.
Am I audible?
Yes, we can hear you.
Okay, okay. I'm audible and visible both, right?
Yes, yeah, both.
Okay, okay.
All
Very
right.
good. Okay.
Yeah.
Allow me to start, please. Okay, a very good evening to all. Myself, Gayatri Rajpurohit from Central University of Gujarat, India. As we all know that this is a time of unrest, I wish you all are safe and having a sound health. The topic of my research paper is explaining double burden in the midst of crisis, women and pandemic. As we all know that calamity, whether it is natural or man-made, women and children are the one of the society, are the one section of the society which were always being affected more than others, right? As women are the half of the population of the world, uh, this is the time of unrest have been linked to increase in interpersonal violence including prevalence of violence against the women and children. My paper will bring into the consideration of the status of women in all the sector of life, which includes inability of women to temporarily escape to abusive partners or the violence of perpetrating from the female health workers. Pandemic or natural calamity, whether natural or man-made, never discriminates. It affects everyone from a layman to the prime minister. This pandemic deepening the pre-existing inequalities of the gender disparities, exposing vulnerabilities in various societal structure and the systems. As we all know that the initial step taken by the governments all over the world is the initial step was the lockdown, and according to me the lockdown is maybe something which is new for the males only, because women moreover like country like India, where we having patriarchal nature of the society, the lockdown rule is not new for the women. Women are facing it since centuries due to the patriarchal nature of the society. Due to economic stress raised by the pandemic, the rate of child labor at the domestic level has been increased to an extent, as the extent goes so far as it is violating the basic human rights, which should be addressed by the governments and the policymakers also. Women who are working as corona warriors in the field of health, sanitization, security, and etc., facing double burden very badly, as they have to fulfill their household responsibilities as well simultaneously with their jobs also. Also, women who are working from home, as there's a culture of as there is a culture which is in trend, the work from home thing, also facing the same double burden, as they have to fulfill the household responsibilities and also the violence or the torture or sexual abuse, each and every mode of violence from their male counterparts. Pandemic shook the other medical facilities which women needs on the daily basis, as I have mentioned some of the issues here, like um, here one thing which I tried to stress on is we cannot restrict the reproductive health to pregnancy or the motherhood only. It includes contraceptions, proper HIV medications, safe and secured abortions are the some basic medical necessities which women need on the daily basis throughout the globe, which have thrown into a disarray by the governments and the policy makers. Another situation which can be seen as a concerning matter is that families who have only one male member and is the only source of income for the family, or we can say that male is the only bread giver to the family, and now that male is suffering from coronavirus and has been isolated to the isolation ward. Here women have to bring bread for the children to fill the empty stomachs also. Meanwhile, she has to take care of the family with the authority. Here we can see like, yes, women have authority, women can be empowered for this, at least for this short period of time. But the double burden is she has to go out and bring money and bring bread for the children and the elderly people also. Simultaneously, she has to fill the household responsibilities also as the caretaker, or with all the motherhood nature of her. The situation may give women authority here over the decision making in the absence of her male counterpart, but the pressure of double role is really affecting her psychologically and the physical health too. When we try to look at the consequences of this double burden, we find that the double burden will figure it out an increase of divorces or the separation of couples because of their too much we can say misunderstanding or the views which do not match to each other. Also due to sexual violence or abuse, there can be baby boom also, which baby boom also due to unwanted pregnancies, which can lead to the increase in population globally. The third outcome which I found is the gender based violence should be need gender-based violence need to be looked by the policymakers or the governments by using the gender lens. I will conclude my paper by saying this: that government should look into the gendered aspect also, that the policies should be the gender neutral, at least gender neutral. I'm not saying that policies should be in favor of only women or should be in favor of children only, but at least policies should be gender neutral. As we all know, when we look into the feminist perspective also of international relations, or maybe you know the thinker Jane Tickner also, she criticized the Hans J. Morgenthau's realism from a feminist lens. She says that all the policy makers are male, they make policies from a male perspective. If males are making policy for women also, here the question is how male can make a policy for women if he cannot experience all the things, all the burden, all the domestic violence. So how can you make a policy on a issue which you never experience? So here I need to request all the policy makers, if they will see this YouTube channel also, this recording on the YouTube also, so please make policy for women also, as we all know that this time of unrest is very challenging for everyone. There is no doubt in this, but women should not be overlooked in this pandemic situation. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Ms. Rajpurohit. You have sort of covered all the aspects that have been sort of being discussed among at least civil society and feminist activists. I invite you to think about another aspect, which has been coming from the perspective of intersectionality. Women with disability are at the receiving end. They are the ones who would want care. And in this kind of scenario, how do we problematize the caregiving aspect of, the construction of women only as caregivers? There are, in terms of intersectionality situations, women with disability who are also care receivers. So I invite you to think through this aspect as well. And we're going to come back to you for your response. But before I go to the next speaker, I think Dr. Fayaz is back. Dr. Fayaz is practically doing what I do because we don't have internet connectivity. So she has moved to a different place, I can see. Can you hear me, Dr. Fayaz? You have to unmute your mic.
Yes.
Yes, okay. So,
yes, I've been running. I'm actually in Lahore for a small family visit, and I'm also attending this initiative as well. So I'm changing room to room from in my sister's home. So, and I think technology isn't women at all, and so there was a breakdown. Maybe somebody was looking that.
All right, so you can just start from the point where you got disconnected. Thank you so much. Over to you.
Yes, the mental health is one of the biggest area that in the Pakistani women continue to suffer. It is not the first time in history that they have suffered because of this trauma, because of the violence as well. So this is a very persistent phenomena, and I think within South Asia and Pakistan in particular, it is regarded as a taboo to discuss your mental health issues with the other female counterparts or men. People think that the one who has a problem is pagal. Pagal means insane. So this is what they call it. But in this case, and then in the double thing on the top of it is the domestic violence that has really risen, and there has been report by the women groups in Pakistan that the women shelters were closed during the COVID, and so were the women helplines. And similar, and after their the flagging of this issue, of course, that was restored by the under the directions of the Imran Khan. So this is something very important. Now coming to the other, there is a host of the unemployment is a big issue for women. People like us who are in academia or in journalism or others who secure, we have not suffered. But practically, I feel that we have suffered because the space between the professional commitments and the home commitment has really shrunk. First, we used to dream it's good to be at home, but really I feel that it is at times it becomes you see a job as a break to meet your friends and colleagues and others. So that firewall has been eroded. So this is something now you can only have the internet, and if the things are not working well, the internet becomes a problem too. So that is a big issue. In case of women, I come across daily is the house workers, the housemaids, the house helps, and the females working in small markets, in small cottage areas. They are really bearing the brunt of everything. And as has been pointed out by earlier speaker, there is a sexual abuse and unwanted sex. That is another thing that is prevalent in our society and not much talked about. Now, last part I would like to flag is what are the tools and means and commitments. In case of Pakistan, we are very well versed society. We always say that our constitution and our religion provides the cover for us to safeguard the women and female rights. Yes, it does. But then why it continues to happen on such a large scale? This is my question. It is an open-ended question. And it really means is that there is a gap between the words and the commitments and its delivery. This is something, and this is not only open to Pakistan case, rather whole of South Asia, whether in case of Islam or in case of Hinduism or any other religion as well. So this is our Ministry of Human Rights is headed by a very strong minister, worded minister, Dr. Shireen Mazari, who has spoken very much in favor of women. But again, the question is that to what extent it will filter down. We have the concept of Darul Aman, that is the women, destitute women, legal measures to register cases against the domestic violence. That is also one of the areas that remains neglected in the anti-poverty policy, and it has really taken a backseat. Then is the distribution of funds. The female small workers that were supposed to get the funds, they're also being bribed and coerced by other people. How to come out of that? I will just move it, since I can see women faces from India, Nepal, and other countries as well. I think it's an excellent way. We need to have the reach out measures. We need to build not only the health diplomacy, we need to build up the women-led health diplomacy or the gendered health diplomacy in South Asia. And this is a very good forum to begin with. And in that, at least in case, I know the women across the borders we face a lot of problems and issues because of the politics and the strategic issues. What we can do is to start the virtual or the joint publications or the virtual interpretations that can be of a big thing to us. Similarly, we can need, in case of Pakistan, I will propose, and other countries may follow, we need the health worker, female health worker groups without borders. So that is sharing the best practices, that is something is required. And so, of course, this comes in fold with the women, peace and security agenda. So that was very much required in our case. I will stop here, and I will look forward to have more communication with all my friends and colleagues in future. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Dr. Fayaz. Since we are sort of, I want to be sure that we are running right for time. I would quickly invite the next speaker. I'm sure there are going to be questions for Dr. Fayaz, and you'd still be here. The questions are going to be in the chat box. Our next speaker is Dr. Manshi Sinha. She is Program Chair and Assistant Professor, Galgotia University. And hi, Manshi. She is going to talk about thinking a gender-responsive policy for migrant women in India. Over to you, Manshi. You've got 10 minutes. Manshi, you'll have to unmute your mic. Your mic is muted.
Am I audible now?
Yeah, we can hear you. Go ahead.
Okay, thank you so much for having me here. It's really been a pleasure part of this great initiative by NIST. Thank you so much. The topic that I'm going to talk about today is on a gender responsive policy for migrant women in India, particularly in the time of COVID-19. Talking about that particular aspect, first put across the current situation right now, that India is already grappling with COVID-19 situation or COVID-19 pandemic, and it is It is all trying its in putting its effort to flatten the curve of COVID-19. Um, so in order to do that, the government already put strictest lockdowns in the world in March. And in April, we see more than 120 million Indians have lost their jobs. What started as an imminent health crisis across the world, including India, now hitting Indian society from 360 degree as it hits different sections of the society differently, and from urban to rural, from rich to poor, from male to female, all across. Now, the pandemic also has exposed the unequal development of societies and prevailing inequality between and within countries that has largely impacted the vulnerables and marginalized communities, particularly women and elderly, disabilities, children, and particularly if we talk about the impact, on women, as I think Abhiruchi has rightly mentioned few, in one of the speakers' comment, that women with disabilities definitely, and also, so the entire society is now all under stress. I'm going to focus on migrant women. So I'm not denying impact on other sections of society, but my focus is on migrant women. So when actually we were under lockdown, what we saw was really unprecedented, and we saw no one on the just after the lockdown, we saw no one on the street, and the local tea shop where factory workers, security guards, auto rickshaws, drivers, and several loads of workers had been moved out of factory premises nearby before the lockdown even started. We saw street vendors, not on road anymore. So this is the general scenario that we are now familiar with under the lockdown process. And on the economic side, the pandemic has already brought the overall Indian economy to a standstill, and it is, although the economy is being eased out a little bit in a phased manner recently with some economic activities opening up across states, it is already now considered as a sluggish economy, and the pandemic had now further crippled Indian economy. Hello? Hello? Okay, so India's all the major industries like construction, financial services, manufacturing sectors, everything has been now, seeing a downturn in their growth. Now, under this situation, when we are talking about migrant women, we have to keep this migrant women within the wider structural context of development discourse. So when we are looking at the development discourse, we are basically considering a wider structure which is already patriarchal in nature and which is tilted towards a capitalist economy, apparently thriving on the principles of welfare aspects. So within this patriarchal capitalist economy, the productivity and beneficiaries have historically been marked through a male discourse. We know that. The citizenship debate also has been shaped through how male would define the benefits of society. Over the period of time, we have seen how through the feminist movements, along with paradigmatic shift in the socio-political system, and along with changes in the global politics and commitments for empowering women, the status of women have changed. So we have one sort of women who could still being able to come out, and they are able to stepping out of their traditional barriers and entering into labor market. There is another segment of women who are still not able to be recognized as workers. So what is women who are not being recognized in the workforce? That's the matter of concern here. Since 90s, if you see that there has been significant economic growth and expansion in India, and with that also has impacted women, in the workforce. Women labor force participation therefore had significantly grown up during 2004-5 with a rate of 37, but which had continuously been showing a decline, coming to around 26.7% in 2009 to 2019. So this is the lowest across developing countries, where women participation rate is very, very low when we talk about female labor force participation. So in general, we see women are already discriminated, less represented in a system which is patriarchal, which is a capitalist economy, which is counting its development in terms of economic growth. So in this context, when we see that that women are not even able to come out in the formal economy, majority of women basically are becoming part of the informal economy. As per data like National Commission for Enterprise in the Unorganized Sector, we have around 95.9% women who are employed as unorganized workers, as against male who are scoring around 90.7%. So this is the percentage of women, if you see, as against the labor force participation of women, which is just 27%. That means women who are willing to even be a part of work, labor force is really less. So within that workforce, when we consider the women in informal workforce, that is 90% contribution. However, they're not visible even in the economy. Why they're not visible in the economy? Because of the types of works that they do within the informal economy. Now, what are the kinds of work they do? They mostly these women, they are basically involved in the work of construction labor, or as domestic workers, or as garment work. They are working in the garment industries. There are also the vendors who are selling their fruits, or a lot of other utensils, petty cosmetics. So they're there in the market. However, they're not being recognized as worker in the formal economy. So while being contributing in the economy, their identity as being being a worker in the informal economy, their contribution is not visible. Okay, therefore all the social security, all the protection that the state is offering even to the women who are already less in the labor market, this set of women are not even getting this many benefits. Now under the COVID lockdown, what has happened is, with the lockdown, all the industries, when it is shutting down, these women who are already invisible in the market, they're also losing out on their job. And because of this, they are highly they are the ones, this group is the one who is hardly hit by the pandemic. We already have the problematic part is that when the entire dynamic of migrant issues have been covered in India. We have exodus of migrants that happened over the last 4 months, where we have seen thousands and thousands of migrant workers moving back to their village hinterlands. News hardly had covered the image of women going back to villages, because within a patriarchal discourse, it is always men who is working. So even women being part of that force, she is not even recognized, she is not even visible. So her hardship is never even shown in the media. So in that condition, what is happening? She is going through a lot of challenges. However, those challenges, those issues are not being highlighted by the media, not by the other domain of knowledge. Even in literature, if you see, less of work has been done on migrant women. If some news have been covered, where one or two instances we came across, where we see some migrant women made news when there was one news when one migrant woman was spotted dragging a large whale suitcase down on the national highway with an exhausted toddler sleeping on top of it. And on her way home in Madhya Pradesh, she looked reluctant to be filmed or talk or so. So a man is speaking on behalf of her. And also we see, some news came up where women were shown to be trafficked. There were news that when we saw migrant women were trafficked into bonded labor in an incense factory, they were raped and all. There were some instances where we saw, this women were delivering babies on the road, and they were there were cases of death. However, the entire picture of their hardship was not covered. Some bits and pieces were coming to us as a news. Uh, so if we now consider what is the possible or anticipated impact that this COVID may have on this migrant women, we can see that this economic shock that has impacted everybody will impact this poorest of poor migrant women to the most, because women and children are disproportionately affected by poverty, we know. And because girls and women of reproductive age are more likely to live in poor households than boys and men. They are also overrepresented in jobs in informal sector that are particularly vulnerable during times of economic upheaval, and often poorly covered by social protection schemes. So this economic shock will definitely hit them hard. Talking about this other issues, like if you talk about there somebody the speaker who just spoke before me was also talking about I think there was one speaker talking about the double burden of women. So we definitely can anticipate that extra burden of household work or unpaid care work for women and girls definitely will go up during this pandemic. There is also possibility of toxic masculinity that may emerge when we also with the coming of with the why toxic masculinity will emerge, because with the closing of public space where male uh, body is usually considered the dwellers of public space, with the closing of the public space when male are entering into the private sphere within a limited constricted space, within a constricted mobility, women have to be stay within a premise where they may not feel secured. There are cases already coming up where domestic violence is on rise across countries, China, US, Europe, even in India. It has been reported that cases of domestic violence, cases of rape already, has been increased. So this also these are some of the challenges. Women also may face greater risk from the health perspective, because where recently when initially there was this migrant exodus happen and all these migrants were going back home, we just saw the conditions of migrant workers. However, we may not anticipate what kind of problems that women could have suffered in terms of her hygiene issue, in terms of sanitation issues, in terms of her safety issues on road. So all these concerns have been really critical when you talk about COVID-19 from a gender perspective. So these are some of the issues that may be considered when we talk about challenges and issues these migrant women may face due to COVID lockdown. So now coming to there are many more issues. Now this set of women, migrant women, when they go back home to their villages, now what will happen? You can imagine that the space they already some women were already involved in the agricultural activities with their family members, male family members moving away from home for work in the cities. When they will go back to those areas, migrant women may again fall short of job activities. Manregas being not much active during these days, they also may face this shortage in income security. There are also cases of cultural predominance where women are supposed to eat less, in terms of in general also they're supposed to eat less, and they're supposed to be the care provider of their family members. So in times of crisis they may not look more after their health, and they have to be more careful about their family members and children. So during this pandemic, I think it will have a larger impact on the health crisis of this migrant women. So now talking about a gender responsive governance, if we really have to overcome this crisis, the government has to make sure that it creates an inclusive policy for everybody, not only for a particular segment of people. They have to the policymakers have to involve women also into the decision making process. I think one of the speakers were telling, unless you involve women in the decision making process, you may not be able to know to what extent the problem arises and how to sort out the problem. So the gender responsive governance is really important now in this time to sort out the COVID impact on migrant women. Hello,
Yeah,
am I audible?
Manshi,
Yes,
are
just
you wrapping up?
am I audible?
Yes, we can hear you, but it's also time for you to wrap
I
up.
will just take 1 minute.
Sure,
I'll just take 1 minute. So
sure.
just talking about a policy response in general, when we make a policy, when policymakers make a policy, I would just like to quote one, very famous political policy thinker, whose name is Carol Bachi. He said that, policymakers need to define a policy problem in the beginning while designing a policy, because that will to a large extent large extent impact the corresponding policy outcome. So in terms of addressing issues of migrant women, unless the policymakers identify policy problem of migrant women, and they do not identify migrant women as such, because they are not visible in the market, visible in the economy. So unless they identify their migrant women as a problem area, the corresponding policy outcome may not be much effective. So first, policy problem, migrant women as a policy problem has to be identified. Then the policy solutions may be more effective. Some of the very good gender responses are coming from across the world, or from India also. For an example, in state of Kerala, we see there is one unit of Kudam Shri, which is a network of women's organization. They have started 1,144 community kitchens in panchayats and municipalities with the help of local self-governments and women only, and they are providing food at the rate of 20 rupees per meal to the communities. Also, women have been involved in in various activities of this Anganwadi workers and Asha workers. They're working day and night as frontline workers for providing homemade masks, take-home rations, environment-friendly homemade plates to eat at quarantine centers, and the migrants and sensitizing villagers on COVID through creative wall painting. We can also learn a lot of gender responsive examples from outside countries also, like Egyptian government has already adopted a COVID-19 response plan by issuing a policy paper on Egypt's rapid response on on women's situation during COVID-19 outbreak. Women survivors in the list of essential services have been identified by Canada government. France and Spain have a policy where they have asked the women who are under any threat or violence to visit any drugstore and simply say code mask 19 behind the counter. And if they say so, it means that they are under threat, under any domestic violence situation. So these are the couple of gender responsive policy examples that we can adopt. Also, at the government level, a lot of stimulus packages are already on the way. However, more of inclusive policy response required, when women should be part of the inclusive policy making. So I think I am running short of time, and I thought of speaking more. But anyway, I thank you so much for listening to me. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Manshi. I'm sure you can come back in the response section. We would be going in at least 2 rounds. So maybe you can, if there's something while responding to the question, you can talk about. It's very interesting, the contrast that Gayatri, Rajpurohit, and your paper together brings. On one hand, you would have this kind of crisis creating a crack, where there are newer possibilities for women to come and take up work because the breadwinner is impacted by COVID. Now, how stable that's going to be is another question, but there is this crack that's opening up. On the other hand, what you have been able to very meaningfully capture is also the several layers of the experience of lived experiences of women migrant workers. Now, all of them are going back, which also means that when there is reverse migration, they will also be pushed inside the household. So on the one hand, you would have newer opportunities cracking up, newer spaces opening up for women. On the other hand, there's a push factor that may work most likely negatively for women. So let me sort of go to the next speaker, and then we'll come back to you during the question and answer session. Thank you so much, Manshi. Our next speaker today is somebody that all of you may already know. She has been continuously in touch with us. A lot of hard work has gone, and now she is also here with us to intellectually engage. Ashmita Gautam, she's a visiting fellow at NICE, and her topic for presentation today is Bridging the Digital Gender Divide. Thank you so much, Ashmita. Over to you. Your time starts now.
Thank you so much. I'm gonna start with my presentation. So my topic is Bridging the Digital Gender Divide. So, just a second. So as we all know, gender-based digital exclusion has many causes. First of all, it has hurdles to access, affordability, lack of education and skills, and technological literacy, along with inherent gender bias and socio-cultural norms. Enhanced, safer, and more affordable access to digital tools is critical because we are at a place where policy interventions is required to address the long-term structural bias. And women, specifically in developing parts of the world, need to be connected. Now, this figure shows the gap that is prevalent globally, with the highest number for sub-Saharan Africa. And I have also collected a few case studies, starting with Ethiopia. In comparison to other countries, Ethiopia lags far behind when it comes to information and communication technology use. 58% of the Ethiopian women are illiterate, which fundamentally restricts their potential to use ICT. The vast majority of public schools in Ethiopia do not provide computer science, and they lack equipment and stable internet connections. Second example is of India. We are already well aware of the digital gap persisting in India. One initiative has been taken by iCure that hands out smartphones and tablets to barely literate women in 6 Indian states. Increasing women's agency has also been running to create a common thread through the discussions with activists, NGOs, and surprisingly also tech companies by targeting the female users. However, there are many concerns in India as well. One of them is virtual abuse. A number of campaigns, however, have been running, like Ready to Report, that is run by Amnesty International India, that try to motivate women to report abuse and to convince law enforcement to take such complaints seriously. But despite all these efforts in India, the digital gender gap is persistent and it is still very high. And now the third example is of Germany. Technological infrastructure is rarely an issue in Germany because even the most remote villages enjoy at least basic internet access in Germany. But women lag behind in terms of digital literacy. Women make up just 15% of all employees in mathematical and technical professions and 20% of IT graduates. This prevails because of lack of self-confidence among the women in terms of technical subjects, and along with that, lack of belief in women's skills is also prevalent. Hence, the startup world in Germany is male dominated. As a result, women in ICT jobs earn 24% less than men. And finally, we have the example of Nepal. Many cases are related to cybercrime, and most of the victims are female in Nepal. There is a lack of interest and confidence among young women while seeking careers in information technology sector due to lack of technological exposure. And other problems are rural connectivity is low, data charge is high, therefore better ICT policies are required in the country to close the digital gender divide. Now moving on, why is bridging the digital gender divide important? First of all, females can earn additional income, increase employment opportunities, and access knowledge and general information. Secondly, women spend 2.6 times more time than men on unpaid care and domestic work, and this restricts the time they can spend in paid work or to upskill themselves. Therefore, action aimed to raise awareness about the digital gender divide among women will challenge the gender stereotypes and norms. So I have created a few glimpses that will help us understand the gap better. First of all, benefits of working in the digital economy. We have flexible hours, more personal time, less stress, no commute, and all these things. Secondly, I have also shown the share of women in the ICT studies, and we have examples of various countries, as you all can see over here. And moving on, I have a third graph that finally shows how women employment can be increased with better work flexibility brought by digitalization. Now, what is the way ahead? Like, where do we see and how do we create the path that we vision right now? First of all, raising awareness about education opportunities is key for women and girls. Women are less likely than men to participate in massive open online courses, which can often be accessed for free, and they cover a range of topics, as we all already know. Informing workers and women specifically about training opportunities can encourage participation, and narrowing the gender wage gap requires policies aimed to equip female workers with more self-organization, management, and communication, along with advanced numerical skills, encouraging greater female enrollment in STEM-related studies and targeting gender bias in curriculum and parental preferences. And finally, diversity brings value, both social and economic. Greater inclusion of women in inventive activities is good not only for women themselves, but also for stronger economic growth and enhanced societal well-being. Now, this is a graph. It's a network graph that shows how software is a male-dominated world, especially in companies. And here, the number of people who can use our package basically is shown, and it's like 78 for female and 922 for male. So we can see the gap that is persistent over here. Now moving on, how do we create a national digital strategy that can help us create a bridge to minimize the gap? First of all, we have to extend networks and digital access through satellite to rural areas. That involves creating awareness by overcoming the cultural barriers with WhatsApp information sharing and influence of government and community leaders. Secondly, creating funds and grant schemes aimed at enhancing the enrollment of women in STEM education is important. Focus can be placed on requirement of mentors and setting up an academy that becomes a safe space of learning for women and girls. And third, can be promoting access to and affordability and use of connected digital devices, along with engaging public officials by using robust data to show the reality. And with this, we can create a clear policy by closing the digital gap. And also very important, boosting availability and promotion of e-banking and mobile money, especially to women and other disadvantaged categories. And finally, increasing online safety and challenging the socio-cultural norms and stereotypes. Now, while creating this national digital strategy, we have to overcome various other things. I think I have already covered most of these topics before: mentorship, overcoming the cultural barriers, and engaging public officials, and getting the girls in STEM. Now, moving on. How do we create a national digital strategy? Like, what are the questions that we should be addressing? First of all, the first question I think for most of the developing countries should be, is there network coverage? Is data service affordable? Are there cultural barriers? If yes, how do we overcome them? How to scale awareness? Is there adequate literacy? How about digital literacy? And do women perceive a need? For example, health information via mobile. I think I had quoted this example from Ethiopia, and we can use that, at a massive level, like globally also. And lastly, we know that digital penetration is increasing, and there are many women right now who own a mobile phone device. But what kind of device do they own? Is it small screen, 12 key entry with very clumsy navigation? And that will not really address our issue, because we are talking about addressing the digital divide at a broader level over here. So these are the questions that we have to address. And finally, where can we learn? So I collected a few examples. First of all, there is a nationwide program, and it's a Mexico Digital Inclusion Program that promotes maternity digital inclusion by promoting infant health along with maternal health. And this has been benefiting more than 30 million Mexicans in poverty. And another example is promoted by British Equality Challenge Unit to promote the inclusion of women in science, technology, engineering, maths, and medicine. The charter now recognizes work undertaken to address gender equality more broadly and not just barriers to progression that affect women. And we also have Equals Global Partnership supporting UN Sustainable Development Goal 5 by empowering women through the use of information and communication technologies. To achieve the goals, focus is on four core issues, that is access to skills, number 3, leadership, and number 4 is research. And finally, we have the example of Internet Sati, that aims to facilitate rural women's engagement by training them in rudimentary internet skills and providing them with an internet-enabled device. And I would like to end by saying, just like moons and like suns, with certainty of tides, just like hope springing high, still I will rise. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Ms. Gautam, for touching upon several issues. Now, what you're talking about is not only at the end of consumer, but also at the end of developer. This gets far more complicated when we know that we are living in a world where AI is also there. And there have been examples how, say, in case of Amazon, when AI was used for hiring, it reinforced the existing gender biases. So the questions that you sort of touched upon, and how do we really look at the question of gender, where you have a construct of a forward-looking man and a backward-looking woman, where the technology access and education is proactively provided. And within that, there's a qualitative difference to men compared to women. And in that context as well, if you would see, if there are less number of pool of women in development as aspect of it, you would also see the consumer side is not going to be very gender sensitive, and you would see lesser and lesser number of women really taking part in. So thank you so much for touching upon several areas. I'm sure there's going to be questions for the audience. We are not taking questions through the mic, so the mics remain closed. You can send your questions though to speakers. Please do mention whom are you addressing, or if it is addressed to everybody, write it in the chat box, and that's where we're going to sort of take the questions from. That brings us to our last speaker, Dr. Seema Kumari Ladsaria. She's an assistant professor in Kalanga Institute of Industrial Technology. And her presentation for today is going to be on migration, economy, and Exodus 1962 in Burma. Over to you, you've got 10 minutes.
Yes, good evening. So I'm the last presenter today, and the topic is a bit unusual. I understand that it's not completely gender centric, but I would certainly try to bring in a lot of gendered issues as well. So before I start with the presentation, I would like to quote this says, "I felt myself to be emotionally stateless. I could not identify with the land of my birth because it stood for the thing I abhorred. I felt no sense of pride when I heard my national anthem or saw a national flag." So we understand with this quote, we understand that the word Burma and the word Myanmar are two different signs. They represent two different ideology. And Burma itself has a very deep migration history. If we look at the political history of Burma, then they have pre-colonial history where and colonial history where a lot of Indian and Chinese immigrants went to Burma to look at the trading avenues, as well as they have a very unique perception over identity, politics, and citizenship. So most of, especially when it comes to Exodus 1962 in Burma, this precisely is based on neoclassical economics. Now, what do I mean by its primary basis on neoclassical economics? So it was a candid response to social and economic change that acts as a catalyst to mass migration. The inequality in Burma was measured in terms of wage differentials and nationalization of industry and private ownership. Now, I would like to bring in a gender point here, that we understand that Burma in before 1962 had 3 lakhs Indians and 10 lakhs Chinese. And it is very interesting to know that Burma's Indians exercised a very less freedom in terms of economic engagement and work, job placements. And also, there's one point to note that before 1962, there was a dissent in Rangoon University. Because of that, Rangoon University was closed down for 2 years. And after that, the university itself was shifted outside the town, where women were not allowed to go to the university, especially Indian women. Alternatively, Burmese women have a lot of exercise over the decisions to be made in-house. Okay, so these perceptions are based on the structural conflicts, structural colonial conflicts, and these are extended over 4 political eras. Now, these 4 political eras are: first political era is parliamentary democracy, which extends from 1948 to 1962. Then we have Tamado-backed socialism, which spans from 1962 to 1988. Now, this is very important. The word Tamado stands for the armed forces that took control over Burma in a while, and we'll talk about it. I'll come back to point here. And then later it was Tamado dictatorship, where the intention of Tamado-backed socialism was to empower peasants and local ethnic section of Burma, but later it turned into dictatorship, and now presently they have quasi-civilian democracy. So one finds 3 kinds of dilemma, 3 kinds of problems that relates to the challenges of democracy in Burma, and these 3 M's are merchants, missionaries, and military. And this activity of empowerment are called this Burmanization. This activity of empowering, or bringing 3 agencies at crossroads are called Burmanization, where they unlearned rather various concepts of identity, history, and language. Now, Burmese use 2 steps. First is Lumo, which means the kinds of people or race they have. And the second is Songato, which means sons or offsprings of geographical division. Now, here Burmese government doesn't have a specific definition for citizenship. They do not have any racist ideology for foreigners or ethnic immigrants or people who have been staying in Burma for a very long time. The idea of citizenship and migrant only came after the political control of Nevin's government. And in this system, women were raped, harassed, and they were looted, because as we understand that in Burma, one finds a lot of sources. And women then acquired a lot of wealth. And after Exodus 1962, when women, came back home, especially Indians and
Interestingly, Chinese movement was less, but it was more in terms of India. And Indian women who got back home, they lost a lot of gold and a lot of jewelry. And as a result, what happened when they came back, they suffered from double or triple oppression, I would rather say. Triple oppression as oppression by triple oppression, I mean, first is loss of finances, second was domestic violence, and the third was they were kept uneducated. So they were not educated at all. In fact, many of the women did not have the primary education. And domestic violence, by domestic violence, I meant most of them were poisoned because they lost a lot of goals. And the only reason they were in Indian household was because they possessed a lot of gold and wealth. Also, and I would like to quote Paul Collier here, who led a very important study in World Bank, and he said that the specific conflict related to post-colonial transition was multi-ethnic society or ethnocratic state where only one nationality group form an absolute majority. These ethnic majorities are Moor, Karen, and Kachin. So these are ethnic tribe there, and most of the wealth, I mean, most of the mineral mines are possessed by these ethnic tribes, which Nevin government tried to take hold over, but couldn't. And this was the major reason of their dictatorship in the country. And also, poverty was a major reason. Now, it is very important to understand that before independence in Burma, most of the Indians went to Burma for the business of money laundering and financing. And because of this reason, what happened is that they took a lot of loan from British banks, and then they lent it to people of Burma. Okay, and in this process, what happened is that despite of lending them money at lower interest, they eventually lost a lot of land. And this loss of land indeed created a kind of dissent in the people. They thought that they are losing their identity, they are losing their ethnicity. So this is very important. Also, if we look at the event of 1962, this happened in 1962. Before 1962, there was a government, there was a parliamentary government called UNU's government, and General Levin was just a part of that government. Later, what happened is because of the idea of Burma's way to socialism. This idea, Nevin's basic political ideology was Burma's way to socialism, and this Burma's way of socialism promoted a lot of upliftment for peasants and local people. That is why there was one thing that happened to Indians was, they were denied of high official ranks, and all of their properties were seized, and most of the cultural capital, like Rangoon, where there were a lot of theaters, there were other private industry. In fact, there was a very impressive library from British Library and Ford Foundation. Ford Foundation used to fund a lot for women education in Burma. So after 1962, that was also seized because the policy of Burma's way to socialism, they somehow denied all the foreigners to spend their money or be there for a longer time. And women in this political context suffered a lot because men somehow went abroad and they could get some education, but women, because although Burma has a very I would say they have a sort of freedom for women to take decisions, but they do not educate their women, and that is the biggest challenge over there till today. And as far as job placements are concerned,
Burmese women get job placements from a very lower rank. Second thing, now if we talk about the citizenship, because when we are talking of migration, we have to also talk about the citizenship. So there are three kinds of citizenship available in Burma. First is full citizenship. So people who were born before 1865, they were offered full citizenship. Associate citizenship, this citizenship was offered to people who were born before 1948. And after that, naturalized citizenship. Okay, so in this case also, I mean, citizenship was restricted to ethnic people and also to foreigners. Why? Because citizenship, despite of them qualifying certain criteria of getting the citizenship, they were denied of citizenship because I'll just finish in a moment maybe. So they were denied of citizenship, and because of this, women were just thrown off out of their country, and they are not nationals of Burma. As a result, what we are seeing in terms of Rohingya community or other foreigners, you know, the problem is that women are at the wretched state because they are being, and they are in a dire state. So with this, I would like to speak a lot, but then I would stop here. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Seema. Now this brings us to the question and answer session. So for audience, you can still write the questions. You can send it to us in chat box. And as I can see, there is a question here for Dr. Aditi Paul. Dr. Aditi Paul is here. Could you please elaborate your argument in favor of having more women in foreign policy positions of power in international relations? Does it draw from biological essentialism and the assumption that women are more peaceful and peace-loving and hence would be assets as foreign policy leaders? So that's a question that is for Dr. Paul. And while she's responding, maybe we'll have other sort of questions from the audience as well.
So I think the question is trying to ask that do you favor more women because they are soft and peace lovers or not? But my presentation was not about arguing that that who should be more in high politics. Is it men or women? I mean, I'm not saying men are wicked, so let's replace them, because then that would be not gender balancing, it will be again gender tilt. So I'm not talking about that. I'm just mentioning and reflecting that there needs to be a focus on lack of female representation. And there's nothing to say about, of course, I mean, women are peace lovers. There are a lot of the feminist advocacies on this only. But I'm not like criticizing the men for that, that they should be replaced in any way. Women should come ahead just because there's no gender parity at this level. At the ministry level, there's nothing like that. At the cabinet level, there is nothing like that. So equality, I am basically talking in my presentation, which is lacking. That's it. I'm not in favor of this biological essentialism thing that, I mean, again, you can even argue that how do you say women are peaceful and men are wicked? I don't know. All sort of arguments can be coming over here. So I'm not going to go into that.
Dr. Paul, I mean, maybe we can come back if there are any other questions from the audience. I don't see any questions. Okay, so let me then sort of pose a few sort of initial remarks and thoughts. First of all, Dr. Paul, you might be aware about the work in international relation that has been done, which problematizes this binary. You're talking about one end of the binary that men are, I'm not sure wicked is the word that is used, but on the question here is on the other side of the binary, which is that women have to be in politics because they might be wired for peace. And this has been problematized. in international relations. So you would have a lot of women coming up and saying that there is nothing essentially, peaceful about women per se. You would also have women, and a case of South Asia for that matter, who are part of militant movement, who are part of terrorist organizations. So they are, and also fundamentalist organizations. We have a rise of right-wing nationalism in which women are as jingoistic as men are. And also resorting to physical violence. So that also has been sort of challenged, that construction, that if the reason for women to be in politics is that they are essentially vying for peace, then our starting point is faulty, and we should rethink our position. Now, that's one point. My question to you is that if we look at female representation, and you were talking about symbolic representation in your presentation, like where would be these spaces where you would have the question of substantive representation finally taking up? Do you see that happening in either the Nordic countries, or do you see that happening in Africa, where the women's representation in parliament is very high? And so that's to Dr. Paul. And then to Ms. Neha Bansal. Now, it's very fascinating that you had opened up a newer category, the idea of sort of which destabilizes liberal feminism, and talking about the possibility from Asian standpoint, and looking at these women who have been part of authoritarian regime. One of the challenges that has come is also that why is this happening? To understand this, one can also see what do these women do. And in that way, it's also related to the question that I asked to Dr. Paul. When these women become part of non-democratic or authoritarian regimes, do you agree with the scholarship which says that they are used to subvert feminist politics? That's one. The second is, do you also see a correlation between civil society activism and rise of women's representation, political representation in parliaments and other bodies? The example in my head is that of Pakistan. So in Parvez Musharraf's time, we saw a lot of women from civil society activists who were incorporated through quota system in the parliament. But later on, they sort of told that they were not able to really work on the agenda that they thought they would be pushing forward. But that was seen as at least a positive stand. So how do you sort of look at this contradiction?
Thanks, Abhiruchi. I'm not quite sure I understand your comment or question, and happy to get a clarification on that. But essentially, I'm talking from the point less of the participation of women and more from the regime. My essential point was that look, we've got to ask different questions at this stage. We've been through several years of doing the same thing when we talk about women empowerment and representation. And in light of that, I was trying to ask a different question, which is what is happening in authoritarian regimes to women. We're seeing a rise in authoritarian regimes. What is happening in authoritarian regimes is a support for feminist, gender-friendly policies. Now, you're absolutely right that once you have that support, and that support is essentially to stabilize the regime and not to stabilize women or stabilize their empowerment. That's absolutely what I was saying too. It sort of dwindles, so the women are left again, sort of asking for their voice or whatever it is that they need while the regime stabilizes. And we've seen the case of that in India, where I shared the example of the current government, which has sort of actually gone after women voters very aggressively, and as well as Vietnam. Just a minute more, which is, I think the solution to my mind is two really. And the first, I think I'm just a little disappointed with discourse after discourse that I attend on women empowerment and anything that's sort of do with women, which sort of sees us as vulnerable all the time. yeah, I mean, we are vulnerable to economic shocks and natural disasters and, social structures and things like that. But then we are also agents. I mean, let's not forget that the CEO of IMF, who's actually getting us out of the COVID mess, is a woman. The chief economist, one of the chief economists, is a woman. New Zealand head is a woman. Service providers and hospitals are women. So let's start talking about that. I think that's really part of the problem. I mean, we are definitely need to be counted as part of the problem as well. We sort of keep pulling ourselves down, and then we expect that we should have equal pay and so on. We're just sort of repeating the same story. And the second bit that I was trying to allude to in my talk is that we've got to find, for us as Asian women, a form of empowerment that is ours, that has less to do with structures that we receive from the West, or universal structures. For example, we tend to regard being enrolled in a school, getting a job, participation in politics, health, etc. These 4-5 parameters as empowerment. But if you ask any woman, do I feel empowered? Having even studied at Harvard, having got all the education, coming from a well-educated family, etc. Am I completely empowered? Do I make my choices myself? I sometimes I think the answer would be no. And the reason for that is that I haven't defined my own empowerment myself, and neither sort it out for myself. And therefore, I brought in the example at Vietnam, which had sort of come up with this idea of Asian style feminism, which is the exotic other women. There's a whole article on that called Vietnamese Poets and Warriors that talks about this, but again, it sort of didn't see the light of day as much as we would have wanted it to.
Okay, I'd like to repeat, I'd like to know the question again.
First was on the other alternative. The question that has been asked to you in the chat box is also looking at a certain kind of binary. So you had talked about projection of men in a certain manner. The question is more related to this whole construction of a binary where you would have this idea that women are essentially wired towards peace, and that is the reason why they should be represented in the parliament. So if that is the standpoint, then we are really, it's a faulty standpoint, it's a faulty beginning, because you would also have examples of in international relations scholarship. I think you had mentioned Tekna, but you would also have scholarship that talks about women's participation on all forms of politics. So you would have regressive politics as well. You would have women part of militant organizations. You would have women part of national struggles. So there are different ways, different roles that women have seen for themselves. The argument is biological determinism, which women have a certain trajectory, certain attachment to of peace, and that's why they should be in the parliament. We will never have this happen.